They called them the twin shadows of Seoul, but to the men who bled in the gutters of Gangnam, they were simply the end of the world. Titan and Ares didn't walk, they prowled, their paws heavy and rhythmic against the polished marble of the Eclipse Lounge. They were 180 pounds of raw, coiled muscle and scarred fur, their eyes like cold amber reflecting the neon pulse of the club. In the underworld, Yoon Dae-sik was the Iron Tiger, a man whose word was law, but even he knew that his power was tethered to the two beasts that stood at his flanks. They were his jury and his executioners. Bred not for the warmth of a home, but for the cold precision of war. The lounge was a cathedral of glass and shadow, thick with the scent of expensive scotch and the underlying metallic tang of the raw meat the dogs had finished moments ago. The air was pressurized. The kind of heavy silence that precedes a storm. At the center of it sat Dae-sik, his silk shirt open to reveal the intricate black ink of a tiger sprawling across his chest. He looked untouchable, a god in a tailored suit, yet the way his hand gripped the heavy leather leashes told a different story. The dogs were restless tonight. Their ears flicked toward the ventilation ducts, their nostrils flaring. They smelled the betrayal before the first muzzle flash illuminated the room. Across the floor, moving like a ghost through the haze of cigarette smoke, was Jane. To the syndicate members, she was just the waitress, a silhouette in a white button-down, a girl who kept her head down and her eyes on the tray. They didn't notice the way she balanced her weight on the balls of her feet, or how her gaze never lingered on the boss, but constantly swept the perimeter. She was a master of being invisible, a tactical ghost hiding in plain sight. While the bodyguards preened and adjusted their holsters, Jane watched the way Titan's hackles rose. She saw the minute twitch in Ares's jaw. She knew that look. It wasn't the look of a pet, it was the look of a weapon being unsheathed. As she approached the VIP table with a fresh bottle of Cristal, the world slowed to a crawl. A bottle of Hennessy shattered on the far side of the bar, not an accident, but a signal. In that heartbeat, the elegant facade of the Eclipse Lounge vanished. The shadows moved. Men in charcoal suits rose from the booths, suppressed pistols glinting under the strobe lights. The twin shadows let out a sound that wasn't a bark, but a primal roar of fury, their spiked collars rattling as they lunged. Chaos had arrived. And as the first bullet tore through the air, the invisible waitress let her tray fall, her eyes locking onto the dogs with a command that was older than the city itself. The transition from elegance to slaughter happened in the space between two heartbeats. As the signal bottle of Hennessy met the floor, the sound wasn't just a crash, it was the opening note of a violent symphony. Crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to shiver as the first suppressed rounds whistled through the air, thudding into the plush leather of the VIP booths. The crowd, a collection of Seoul's elite and their dangerous counterparts, became a panic tide of silk and screams, but Jane stood anchored in the center of the storm. Jane's tray didn't just fall, she discarded it with a tactical flick of her wrist, sending the heavy silver platter spinning toward the nearest gunman. It was a reflex born of years in the mud and grit of K9 combat zones, a past she had tried to drown in the mundane rhythm of service work. But as the muzzle flashes strobed against the dark walls of the Eclipse Lounge, the waitress died, and the sergeant returned. Yoon Dae-sik was down, his chair kicked back as he reached for the weapon tucked into the small of his back, but the sheer volume of incoming fire pinned him. His bodyguards were falling, their training no match for the coordinated precision of the Golden Fang hitmen. At his feet, Titan and Ares was a whirlwind of terror. Driven mad by the high-pitched whine of the suppressors and the scent of ozone and blood, the Pitbulls weren't defending their master, they were losing their minds. Ares snapped blindly at the air, his massive jaws clicking inches from Dae-sik's throat, while Titan began to bolt, his instincts screaming for him to flee the invisible sting of the bullets. Titan. Ares. Halt. The command cut through the roar of the club like a whip crack. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a low, resonant vibration that carried the weight of absolute authority. To Dae-sik's shock, the dogs froze. Amidst the whirring fans and the screams of the dying, they turned their amber eyes toward the woman in the white button-down shirt. Jane didn't hesitate. She dove through the crossfire, her body rolling across the glass-strewn floor with a grace that ignored the shards tearing at her skin. She came up in a crouch beside the dogs, her hands moving with lightning speed. She didn't grab their collars with force, she touched the pressure points behind their ears, a grounding contact that pulled them back from the brink of a fear-induced frenzy. "Watch me," she hissed, her voice a serrated edge. "Front. Guard." The hitmen were closing in, 3 of them advancing on the Iron Tiger's position, their pistols raised for the finishing coup de grace. Dae-sik looked up, blood trickling from a graze on his temple, and saw a sight he would never forget. The waitress, her face a mask of cold, predatory focus, was directing his hounds with subtle shifts of her shoulders and sharp, guttural clicks of her tongue. Titan and Ares transformed. The frantic, wild energy vanished, replaced by a terrifying, singular purpose. At Jane's silent signal, the dogs launched. They didn't bark, they were silent shadows of muscle and teeth. Titan hit the first assassin mid-stride, 90 pounds of momentum shattering the man's ribs before his teeth found the wrist holding the gun. Ares bypassed the first man, leaping over a low table to take the second hitman by the throat, the metallic clatter of a dropped weapon echoing against the marble. Jane wasn't done. She lunged forward, snatching a fallen handgun from the floor. She didn't fire wildly. She squeezed the trigger twice, 2 muffled pops, and the third assassin slumped over a velvet sofa, a neat pair of holes appearing in center mass. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the dogs and the wet, gurgling sounds of the wounded. The remaining attackers, seeing their vanguard decimated by 2 dogs and a server, retreated into the smoke and the service exits. Jane stood slowly, her shirt stained with liquor and the dark spray of the hitman's blood. She didn't look at the carnage. She looked at the dogs. She clicked her tongue twice, and the 2 apex predators returned to her side, their tails low, their eyes fixed on her as if she were the only thing left in a burning world. Yoon Dae-sik pulled himself up using the edge of the table, his breath coming in shallow hitches. He looked at his men, dead or groaning on the floor. He looked at the twin shadows, now sitting obediently at the feet of a woman who, 5 minutes ago, had been clearing his empty glasses. He didn't thank her. He didn't reach for his gun. He stared at the way her hands didn't shake as she reached down to wipe a smear of blood from Titan's snout. "Who are you?" Dae-sik asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Jane finally looked at him, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving behind the cold realization that her cover was blown, her sanctuary was gone, and she had just saved the most dangerous man in Seoul. "The check is on the table, Mr. Yoon," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "I think I'm finished with my shift." But as Dae-sik's remaining guards flooded the room, their weapons drawn and eyes wide, Jane knew she wasn't going anywhere. The Iron Tiger had found a weapon more valuable than gold, and he had no intention of letting it walk out the door. The sirens began their mournful wail in the distance, a sound that usually signaled the end of a conflict. But for Jane, it felt like the beginning of a sentence. The Eclipse Lounge was a graveyard of broken glass and shattered illusions. The smell of copper and expensive cologne hung thick in the air, a cloying reminder of how quickly a night of luxury could descend into a slaughterhouse. Jane stood at the center of the wreckage, her lungs burning as the adrenaline began its slow, painful retreat. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thrum of Titan and Ares at her sides. They were no longer the wild, panicked beasts that had nearly torn their own master apart moments ago. Now, they were statues of black muscle, their eyes locked onto the service entrance she had cleared. They weren't looking at the dead, they were looking for the next threat. They were waiting for her voice. Yoon Dae-sik remained seated on the floor, his back against the mahogany bar, watching her with a gaze that was far more dangerous than the hitman's bullets. He was a man who built his empire on the predictability of fear, yet he had just watched a woman who earned $12 an hour dismantle a professional hit squad with nothing but a stolen pistol and 2 clicks of her tongue. "You're bleeding," Dae-sik said. His voice was steady, devoid of the shock that gripped his surviving men. He gestured vaguely to her arm, where a shard of the shattered Hennessy bottle had sliced through her sleeve, blooming a jagged red flower against the white cotton. Jane didn't look at the wound. She didn't look at the bodies. She looked at the exit. "The police will be here in 3 minutes. Your men need to clear the back alley, or the Golden Fang won't be the only ones looking for a statement tonight." She turned to leave, her boots crunching over the remains of a $1,000 chandelier, but she didn't get 3 steps before a wall of black-suited men blocked her path. These weren't the panicked guards from the ambush, these were the inner circle, the cold-eyed professionals who handled the Iron Tiger's most private affairs. They didn't point their guns at her, they knew better after seeing what she had done, but their presence was a silent, immovable no. "I told you," Dae-sik said, rising slowly to his feet and brushing the dust from his tailored trousers as if he hadn't just been seconds from a shallow grave. "The check is on the table. But I don't pay my debts with cash, and I certainly don't let my lifesavers walk into the night as if nothing happened." "I'm not looking for a reward, Mr. Yoon," Jane replied, her voice dropping into that low, tactical register that made the dog's ears perk up. "I'm looking for my coat. And then I'm looking for a new job, because I doubt the manager is going to appreciate the bullet holes in the upholstery." Dae-sik stepped closer, stepping into the halo of a flickering neon light. The tiger tattoo on his chest seemed to ripple with every breath. He stopped just outside her personal space, his eyes scanning her face, searching for the fear that wasn't there. He saw the way she held herself, the slight bend in the knees, the chin tucked just enough to protect the throat, the eyes that never stopped tracking the room. "You're military," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Specialized. K-9, likely. But you didn't just train them. You lived with them. You think like them." Jane's jaw tightened. The mention of her past was like a physical blow, a ghost reaching out of the dark to pull her back to the mud of a country she tried to forget. "I'm a waitress. Or I was. Now, I'm just someone who wants to go home." "Home?" Dae-sik let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any mirth. "The Golden Fang saw your face. They saw you turn my dogs into their executioners. You think they're going to let you go home and sleep? You think they're going to let the only variable they didn't account for just exist?" The logic was a cold splash of water. Jane knew he was right. In the world of the syndicate, there were no bystanders, only witnesses and liabilities. By saving him, she had tied her thread to his, and the Golden Fang would cut both without hesitation. Titan and Ares haven't let anyone touch them in 3 years, Dae-sik continued, stepping even closer. He reached out a hand toward Titan's head, and for a split second, the dog's lip curled, a low vibration starting in his chest. Jane didn't say a word, but her eyes shifted. The dog instantly went silent, leaning his weight into her leg. Dae-sik pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable. My men provide me with loyalty because I pay them. My dogs provide me with terror because I feed them. But you. They gave you their souls. Because they recognize a predator when they see one. He leaned in, his voice a whisper that barely carried over the distant sirens. You can walk out that door, Jane. You can go to your apartment, wait for the kick at the door, and die a waitress. Or you can come with me. You can fix what's broken in them, and in return, I will make sure the people you're running from never find you. Jane looked at the 2 dogs. She saw the scars on Titan's flanks and the nervous tick in Ares's left ear, marks of a life spent as tools of violence, misunderstood and mishandled. They were monsters to everyone else, but she saw the trauma beneath the teeth. She saw herself. The sirens were blocks away now. The blue and red lights began to dance against the smoke windows of the lounge. I don't work for monsters, Jane said, her voice final. Good, Dae-sik replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then work for the dogs. Because without you, they'll be put down before the sun rises for what they did tonight. No one else can control them. Now. Not even me. Jane looked down at Ares, who let out a soft, mournful whine and licked the blood from her hand. It was the oldest trick in the book, the hostage move. But it wasn't a man he was holding over her, it was the only 2 creatures in this city who spoke her language. She took a breath, the scent of the lounge, the smoke, the salt, the blood, filling her lungs one last time. If I go with you, I set the rules for the hounds. No muzzles. No cages. No cruelty. I expected nothing less, Dae-sik said, gesturing toward the back exit as his men began to vanish into the shadows. Jane didn't run. She didn't look back at the shattered glass of the only normal life she had ever known. She walked toward the darkness of the waiting SUVs, a twin shadow on either side, stepping out of the role of the waitress and into the skin of the handler once again. The Iron Tiger had his protectors back, but as they moved into the night, it was clear to everyone present, he wasn't the one leading the pack. The black SUVs moved through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul like a funeral procession, silent and ominous. Inside the lead vehicle, the air was thick with the scent of wet fur and the sterile smell of expensive leather. Jane sat in the middle of the back seat, her arms resting on the broad, warm backs of Titan and Ares. They hadn't left her side since the lounge, their heavy heads resting on her thighs, their rhythmic breathing the only sound in the cabin. Across from her, shrouded in the shifting shadows of passing streetlights, Yoon Dae-sik watched her with the stillness of a statue. You haven't asked where we're going, Dae-sik remarked, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. I know where we're going, Jane replied, her eyes fixed on the window. To a fortress. You don't survive an assassination attempt like that and go back to a penthouse with glass walls. Dae-sik leaned back, a flicker of amusement crossing his features. A fortress. Is that how you see it? Most would call it a sanctuary. To me, it is simply the only place where the world can't touch what belongs to me. The vehicle eventually slowed, turning onto a private road that wound upward into the mist-covered
Hills of Songbuk-dong. They passed through 2 sets of reinforced steel gates, guarded by men who didn't just carry pistols, but submachine guns slung over their tactical vests. When the SUV finally came to a halt, it was in front of a sprawling estate of dark stone and floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that made the structure look as if it were glowing from within. As Jane stepped out, the dogs moved with her, flanking her instantly. She took in the perimeter, the high-definition cameras, the motion sensors, the guards standing at 20-meter intervals. It was a masterpiece of security, but to Jane's trained eye, it felt like a prison. "Welcome to your new home," Dae-sik said, walking past her toward the massive oak doors. "My home is a studio apartment in Mapogu," Jane said, her voice echoing in the cold night air. Dae-sik stopped and turned, his silhouette framed by the light of the entryway. "Your apartment was compromised the moment the first bullet hit the floor tonight. My men have already cleared your belongings. There is nothing left for you there but a target on your back." Jane felt a surge of cold fury, her fingers tightening in the fur of the dogs' necks. "You didn't ask." "I don't ask for permission to save a life," he countered. "Especially not when that life is now the most valuable asset in my organization. You didn't just save me, Jane. You tamed the untamable. That makes you a legend to my friends and a priority to my enemies." He led her inside, and the interior was as cold and beautiful as the man himself. Minimalist furniture, priceless ink wash paintings, and a silence so profound it felt heavy. He directed her to a wing of the house that had been hastily prepared. It was a suite larger than her entire apartment, filled with the scent of fresh linens and cedar. On the bed lay several boxes of high-end tactical gear and civilian clothes, all in her size. "I had my people do some research while we were in transit," Dae-sik said, standing in the doorway. Jane Doe. A ghost with a military record that was wiped clean 3 years ago. No family. No paper trail. You've worked very hard to be nobody. But nobody doesn't handle war dogs like they're part of her own soul. Jane stepped into the room, the dogs following her and immediately claiming the rug at the foot of the bed. She turned to face him, the distance between them crackling with unspoken tension. "What do you want from me, Dae-sik? You have guards. You have money. You have power." "I have those things, yes," he said, his expression softening into something more predatory. "But my guards are afraid of my dogs. My money can't buy the loyalty of a beast that wants to rip my throat out. And my power is useless if I am killed by my own protectors in a moment of panic." He stepped into the room, closing the distance until he was inches away. Jane didn't flinch. She smelled the iron of the blood still on his shirt and the faint, expensive spice of his cologne. "I want you to make them what they were meant to be," he whispered. "And in exchange, you will have the one thing you've been running for. Safety. No one looks for a ghost inside the tiger's den." "Safety is a myth in your world," Jane said, her voice steady. "Then call it a partnership," Dae-sik replied. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, a gesture that was half threat and half caress. "You are the only person they listen to. That makes you the most powerful person in this house. Use that power, Jane. Because the Golden Fang is coming back, and next time, I want my dogs to be ready to hunt." He pulled away before she could respond, leaving her alone in the sprawling, luxurious silence. Jane looked at the dogs, who were already watching her with expectant, intelligent eyes. She walked to the window, looking out at the high walls and the armed men patrolling the grounds. She was safe.
She was fed. She was protected by the most feared man in Korea. But as she watched the moonlight glint off the razor wire atop the perimeter fence, she knew the truth. The Iron Tiger hadn't just given her a sanctuary, he had built her a golden cage, and the only way out was to become the very monster she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Jane sat on the edge of the bed, her hand finding Titan's head. "We're back in the war, boys," she whispered. The dog let out a low huff of agreement, and for the first time in years, Jane didn't feel like a waitress. She felt like a soldier waiting for the dawn. The sun rose over the Songbukdong hills, but it did not bring warmth to the sprawling estate, it only cast long, skeletal shadows across the training grounds. Jane stood in the center of a wide, fenced enclosure at the rear of the property, her boots sinking slightly into the dew-dampened grass. She had stripped off the high-end silk she'd been given, opting instead for the black tactical cargo pants and compression shirt she'd found in the crates. They felt like a second skin, a uniform she had hoped never to wear again. Titan and Ares stood 20 paces away, their bodies tense, their ears pinned back. To any of the guards watching from the balcony above, the Pitbulls looked like ticking time bombs. They had spent years being rewarded for aggression and punished for hesitation. They didn't know how to exist without a target. "You're not doing anything," a voice called out. Yoon Dae-sik stood by the gate, his hands buried in the pockets of a dark cashmere coat. He had been watching her for 20 minutes, his eyes tracking her every micro-movement. "I expected a spectacle. Whips, collars, the sounds of discipline. You're just standing there." "They've had enough discipline to last 3 lifetimes," Jane said, not turning her head. Her eyes remained locked on the dogs. "Discipline is about fear. Training is about trust. Right now, they're waiting for me to hurt them. Until they realize I won't, we're just 3 killers in a yard." She took a slow, deliberate step forward. Titan let out a low, vibrating growl, the sound of a tectonic plate shifting. Jane didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She kept her heartbeat slow, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. She was projecting a calm so absolute it acted like a physical weight in the air. "Titan, break," she murmured. The dog's growl hitched. It was a command he didn't recognize, but the tone, soft, melodic, yet unyielding, made him tilt his head. She reached into her pouch and tossed a small piece of dried venison. It landed between his paws. He didn't eat it. He stared at her, suspicious of the gift. "They've been fed on a schedule of violence, Dae-sik," Jane said, her voice carrying across the yard. "They eat when they kill. They sleep when they're exhausted. You've turned them into extensions of your own rage. If you want them to be guardians, they need to learn that their power belongs to them, not the leash." She spent the next hour in a dance of proximity. Step, wait, retreat. Step, wait, retreat. It was a grueling test of patience that would have bored a lesser handler, but Jane saw the minute changes, the softening of Ares's eyes, the way Titan finally snapped up the treat when he thought she wasn't looking. Dae-sik walked into the enclosure, his presence immediate and disruptive. The dogs instantly bristled. Their training as Iron Tiger enforcers overriding the progress Jane had made. They moved to flank him, but their posture wasn't protective, it was anxious. They were afraid of failing him. "Watch their tails," Jane whispered as Dae-sik approached. "See how they're tucked. They aren't ready to die for you. They're ready to die because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. That's Why they lost it in the club. Fear-based training breaks under pressure. Trust-based training hardens. Dae-sik looked down at his hounds, really looking at them for the first time as something other than living weapons. He saw the jagged scars on Ares's shoulder and the way the dog flinched when he moved his hand too quickly. I was taught that mercy is a weakness in this city, Dae-sik said, his voice dropping an octave. If my dogs are soft, my enemies see an opening. There is nothing soft about a dog that chooses to protect you, Jane countered. She walked up to Ares, and for the first time since the night of the ambush, she reached out. The pitbull didn't growl. He lowered his head, allowing her palm to rest firmly between his ears. A dog that fears its master is a liability. A dog that loves its master is an apocalypse. The silence that followed was heavy. Dae-sik watched her hand against the dog's black fur, the contrast of her dark skin against the animal's coat, and for a fleeting second, the Iron Tiger mask slipped. He looked like a profoundly lonely man, a man who had built a world where nothing, not even his own pets, could be trusted to stay. Teach them, Dae-sik said, his voice almost a rasp. Teach them to be an apocalypse. He turned to leave, but stopped at the gate. And Jane? My men found the Golden Fang scout who was watching your apartment. He won't be reporting back. You're not just training my dogs. You're the only reason I'm not cleaning up a much bigger mess. Don't think for a second that I don't know the value of what you're doing here. As he disappeared back into the stone fortress, Jane let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked down at Ares, who was now leaning his full weight against her leg, and Titan, who had crawled closer, his chin resting on her boot. She had begun to rehabilitate the monsters, but as she looked at the door Dae-sik had just walked through, she realized the dogs were the easy part. The real monster was the man who owned them. And he was the one who was beginning to trust her. That was the most dangerous development of all. The transition from the training yard to the inner sanctum of the estate felt like moving from a war zone to a courtroom. The air inside the main hall was frigid, the silence heavy with the collective breath of 20 men lined up against the charcoal gray walls. These were Yoon Dae-sik's lieutenants, his high-level earners, and his most trusted shadows. But trust was a currency that had been devalued the moment the Golden Fang hitmen had bypassed 3 layers of security at the Eclipse Lounge. Jane stood at the head of the hall, dressed in her black tactical gear, looking less like a waitress and more like a high priestess of a violent religion. At her sides, Titan and Ares sat perfectly still. They were no longer the lunging, snarling messes of the previous week. They were silent sentinels. Their heads were level, their breathing synchronized, and their amber eyes scanned the line of men with a terrifying, mechanical precision. You're wasting our time, boss, Min-kyu, a senior captain with a jagged scar across his eyebrow, spat out. He didn't look at Jane. He kept his eyes on Dae-sik, who sat in a throne-like leather chair at the end of the hall, nursing a glass of neat bourbon. We're letting a girl and 2 mutts play detective while the Golden Fang prepares their next move? This is an insult. Dae-sik didn't look up from his glass. The dogs didn't miss a beat at the lounge, Min-kyu. My men did. Someone gave the Fang the frequency of our encrypted comms. Someone told them exactly which booth I'd be in. And someone made sure the back exit was unlocked. He finally raised his eyes, and the coldness in them made the room temperature drop another 10 degrees. The dogs don't care about rank. They don't care about how many years you've served. They only care about the scent of a lie. Jane stepped forward, her boots clicking softly on the marble. She didn't need to give a verbal command. She tapped her thigh twice, a silent signal for search. "Walk the line," Jane whispered, her voice low and melodic. The dogs moved as one. They didn't growl. They didn't bark. They began at the far left, weaving through the legs of the men. It was a psychological war. The men were seasoned killers, used to facing guns and blades, but there was something primal and unsettling about the way the pitbulls moved. Sniffing the air, their muzzles hovering inches from palms and waistbands. Jane watched the men's physiological reactions. She wasn't just looking for the dogs to alert, she was watching the dilation of pupils, the twitching of carotid arteries, and the way some men held their breath as Titan's cold nose brushed their suit jackets. "Dogs can smell cortisol, the stress hormone," Jane explained to the room, her voice echoing in the rafters. "They can hear your heart rate skip a beat from 10 feet away. If you're innocent, you're just a statue to them. If you're hiding something, you're prey." They reached the middle of the line. A young lieutenant named Han, known for his fast cars and even faster rise through the ranks, visibly paled. Ares stopped in front of him. The dog didn't attack. He simply sat down. His amber eyes locked onto Han's face, a silent accusation more terrifying than a pointed finger. "Han," Dae-sik said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "It's the dog, boss. The girl is playing tricks." Han stammered, his hand twitching toward his jacket. Titan instantly moved, a blur of black fur that pinned Han against the wall before his hand could even reach his holster. The dog didn't bite, he stood on his hind legs, his massive paws on Han's shoulders. His face inches from the man's throat. A low, guttural vibration started in Titan's chest, not a bark, but a countdown. Jane walked over, her face a mask of calm. She reached into Han's inner pocket, bypassing the gun, and pulled out a burner phone. She flipped it open. The last outgoing call was to a number with a prefix associated with the Golden Fang's territory. "The Hounds don't lie, Mr. Yoon," Jane said, tossing the phone onto the floor at Dae-sik's feet. The room erupted into motion. Two of Dae-sik's loyalists grabbed Han, dragging him toward the soundproof basement as he screamed for mercy. The remaining lieutenant stood in a state of shock, looking at the two dogs with a newfound, paralyzing respect. Dae-sik stood up, walking toward Jane. He looked at Titan and Ares, who had returned to their seated positions at her side, as calm as if they had just been on a morning walk. He then looked at Jane. Seeing the smudge of grease on her cheek and the absolute, unwavering steel in her gaze. "You didn't just find a traitor," Dae-sik said, reaching out to touch the silver-spiked collar on Ares. The dog allowed it, but his eyes remained on Jane, waiting for her approval. "You've changed the power dynamic of this entire city. My men won't fear me as much as they fear those two. And they won't fear those two as much as they fear the woman who commands them." "I told you," Jane said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "They aren't weapons. They're sentinels. They see the monsters because they've been raised by one." Dae-sik's hand paused on the collar. He looked at her, the mask of the Iron Tiger cracking just enough to show a flicker of something that looked like admiration, or perhaps, something far more dangerous. "Then I suppose it's time we stopped hiding you in the shadows, Jane. The Golden Fang will be looking for Han. Let's show them that the tiger has grown a new set of teeth." As they walked out of the hall, the two pitbulls trailing them like living shadows, Jane realized she was no longer just a handler. She was the architect of Dae-sik's new world order. But as she felt the burner phone's weight in her memory, she wondered how long it would be before the Hounds smelled the secrets she was still keeping from the man she had just saved. The high of the interrogation room had long since bled into a cold, bone-deep ache. The estate was silent, save for the hum of the air filtration and the heavy, synchronized breathing of the dogs. Jane stood in the center of her suite's expansive bathroom, the steam from the shower beginning to fog the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She reached back, unzipping her tactical vest, and let the heavy gear fall to the floor with a dull thud. Then came the compression shirt, peeled away like a second skin. In the reflection, the waitress was nowhere to be found. In her place stood a map of a forgotten war. A jagged, silvery line of scar tissue ran from her left shoulder blade down to her ribs, the mark of a shrapnel spray in a desert she wasn't supposed to be in. On her thigh was the puckered indentation of a bite mark, an old memory of a K-9 partner who had lost his mind to a roadside bomb. These were the receipts of a life spent in the service of a country that had eventually branded her a ghost. A soft click at the door made her freeze. Her hand instinctively went to the countertop, fingers searching for a weapon that wasn't there. "I've spent 3 years looking at men's scars, Jane. I know the difference between a street fight and a battlefield." Yoon Dae-sik was standing in the doorway. He didn't look like the Iron Tiger now, he wore a simple black robe, his hair dampened from his own shower. He wasn't looking at her face, his eyes were fixed on the serial number tattooed in small, faded ink just below her collarbone. Jane didn't reach for a towel to cover herself. She met his gaze in the mirror, her eyes hard and defiant. "You're breaking our agreement, Mr. Yoon. This is my space." "The Golden Fang didn't just find Han," Dae-sik said, stepping into the room. He held a thick manila folder in his hand. "They found a file. A classified record from a private military contractor operating out of the Horn of Africa. Sergeant Jane Vance, lead handler for the Black Ops K-9 unit. Dishonorably discharged for insubordination after refusing to leave a wounded unit behind during a scorched earth retreat." Jane felt the air leave her lungs. The name, Jane Vance *, sounded like a foreign language. She had buried that woman in a shallow grave 3 years ago. "The man you defied was Captain Miller," Dae-sik continued, leaning against the marble vanity. "He's a senator now. And he's been spending a lot of money to make sure you never reappear. The Golden Fang didn't just want my territory, Jane. They were offered a bounty to deliver you to him." Jane turned to face him, the steam swirling around them like a shroud. "Now you know. I'm not just a waitress, and I'm not just a handler. I'm a liability. If Miller knows I'm here, he'll bring more than just triad hitmen. He'll bring professionals." Dae-sik stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the small space. He reached out, his fingers stopping just short of the scar on her shoulder. "You think I'm afraid of a senator? In this city, I am the law. And in this house, you are the only person who hasn't tried to lie to me for a paycheck." "I lied about who I was," she hissed. "No," he replied, his voice a low, dark caress. "You lied about your name. But every time you look at Titan and Ares, every time you stand your ground against a gun, you tell me exactly who you are. You're a woman who refuses to leave her pack behind. And right now, Jane, I am your pack." He dropped the folder onto the counter. "I had my digital teams burn the original server where this was stored. As far as the world is concerned, Jane Vance died in Africa. But here, you are the woman who saved the tiger. That makes you untouchable." Jane looked down at the file, at the grainy photo of her younger self in desert fatigues, a German shepherd at her side. She felt a sudden, sharp sting in her eyes, the first time she had felt the weight of her own history in years. Dae-sik's hand finally closed the gap, his palm resting against the side of her neck. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold marble behind her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why go to this much trouble for a ghost?" Dae-sik leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the mask of the mafia boss was gone, leaving only the man who had survived 1,000 betrayals. "Because the monsters I live with only respect strength. But the monster I am, he only respects loyalty. You're the first thing I've found in this life that isn't for sale." Outside the bathroom, Titan and Ares let out a low, collective huff, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Jane closed her eyes, letting out a breath she had been holding for 3 years. She wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a ghost. She was a soldier who had finally found a general worth fighting for. "They'll come for us," Jane warned, her voice barely a breath. "Let them," Dae-sik replied, his grip tightening just enough to ground her. "I've been waiting for a reason to burn this city to the ground. Now, I have someone to hold the torch." As the steam cleared, the reflection in the mirror showed them both, 2 scarred survivors. Surrounded by shadows, ready to face the world with the twin shadows at their heels. The secret was out, but the war had only just begun. The purge of the syndicate was not an event of shouting and gunfire, it was a ghost story told in the quiet corners of the estate. The night air was heavy with the scent of pine and the coming rain, a damp veil that muffled the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Inside the security hub, the monitors flickered with blue light, casting long shadows across Yoon Dae-sik's face as he watched the perimeter. But Jane wasn't looking at the screens. She was looking at the dogs. Titan and Ares were different tonight. There was no restlessness, no pacing. They sat by the heavy, reinforced doors of the command center, their bodies vibrating with a low-frequency tension that only Jane could interpret. They had tasted the scent of betrayal once before at the lounge, and their primal instincts had been sharpened into a surgical tool. "He's here," Jane said, her voice barely a whisper. Dae-sik didn't ask how she knew. He simply signaled his men to cut the external lights. The estate plunged into a suffocating darkness, save for the infrared glow of the tactical HUDs. "Min-kyu," Dae-sik murmured, the name of his most senior captain tasting like ash. 30 years of loyalty, traded for a promise from the Golden Fang. "He isn't coming alone," Jane noted, her eyes tracking the way Ares's ears swiveled toward the north wall. "He's brought a specialized team. Low thermal signatures, suppressed weapons. They're moving through the blind spots of your cameras. Or rather, the blind spots Min-kyu created for them." She knelt between the 2 pitbulls, her hands resting on their collars. She didn't use the heavy leather leashes tonight. They were beyond that. "Today, we don't bark," she whispered into their ears, her breath hitching as she felt the heat radiating from their coiled muscles. "Silent teeth, boys. Silent teeth." The breach happened at 0200 hours. A side service door, supposedly locked from the inside, clicked open. Min-kyu led the way, his face a mask of cold desperation. Behind him were 4 men in tactical gear, moving with the rhythmic precision of professional killers. They moved toward Dae-sik's private study, unaware that the shadows in the hallway were alive. Jane released the collars. She didn't shout. She made a sharp, clicking sound with her tongue. A command for infiltrate. Titan and Ares vanished into the gloom. They didn't move like dogs, they moved like smoke. Because Jane had retrained their gait, they stepped with their weight on their pads, avoiding the creak of the floorboards. Min-kyu and his team reached the foyer, their weapons raised. "One more haul," Min-kyu hissed, his voice trembling slightly. "The tiger is in the study. Make it fast." He never saw the shadow detach itself from the velvet curtains. Titan struck first. There was no snarl. Only the sickening thud of 100 pounds of muscle hitting the lead mercenary mid-stride. The man went down without a cry, his windpipe crushed instantly by Titan's precision strike. Before the second man could turn his weapon, Ares was there, a blur of teeth that found the gap in the man's tactical vest. The Knight of Silent Teeth was a masterclass in predatory efficiency. Jane followed behind the dogs. A suppressed pistol in her hand, but she didn't need to fire a single shot. She watched through the darkness as her monsters disassembled the intruders with a terrifying, quiet grace. They weren't fighting out of fear anymore, they were protecting their pack leader. Min-kyu was the only one left standing, his pistol shaking as he backed into the center of the hall. He looked around at the bodies of his elite team, seeing only the glowing amber eyes of the Pitbulls circling him in the dark. Dae-sik. Min-kyu screamed, the silence finally breaking. "Come out and face me. Don't let these beasts do your work." The lights flickered on, blindingly bright. Dae-sik stood at the top of the grand staircase, his hands behind his back. Beside him stood Jane, her face cold and unreadable. "The beasts aren't doing my work, Min-kyu," Dae-sik said, his voice echoing in the hollow hall. "They're doing theirs. You brought a war into my house, and you forgot that I have the only 2 soldiers who can't be bought." Titan moved closer to Min-kyu, his lip curling just enough to show the white of his fangs. The dog looked at Jane, waiting. One word from her, and the traitor would be erased. "Jane," Dae-sik said softly. Jane looked at Min-kyu, a man who had sold his soul for a throne he didn't earn. She saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had seen in the men who had abandoned her in the desert. She felt the power vibrating through the dogs, a weapon more potent than any gun she had ever carried. "He isn't worth their peace," Jane said, her voice steady. "The dogs have done enough. Let the law of the syndicate handle the rest." At her command, a soft heel, Titan and Ares backed away, their job finished. They returned to her side, sitting with a regal posture that mocked Min-kyu's cowardice. As Dae-sik's loyalists emerged from the shadows to drag the traitor away, the Iron Tiger looked at Jane. The estate was safe again, the internal rod excised, but the air remained charged. They had survived the traitor in the ranks, but the Golden Fang was still out there, and they now knew that the tiger didn't just have hounds, he had a commander. "You handled that with more mercy than I would have," Dae-sik remarked as the dogs licked the salt from Jane's palms. "It wasn't mercy for him," Jane replied, looking into the eyes of the hounds she had saved. "It was for them. I won't let you turn them back into killers just because you're angry." Dae-sik walked down the stairs, stopping on the step above her so they were eye to eye. "Then we prepare for the final move. The Golden Fang won't send shadows next time. They'll send an army. Then we'll give them a war," Jane said. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a victim of her past. She felt like the master of her future. The sky over Seoul didn't just rain, it wept in heavy, slate-gray sheets that blurred the line between the city lights and the darkness of the Songbuk-dong hills. The atmosphere was thick with the electric charge of an approaching storm, but the real lightning was already inside the estate. Jane stood in the
Center of the reinforced courtyard, the rain slicking her hair against her skull, her eyes fixed on the main gate. Beside her, Titan and Ares were anchored shadows. They didn't shiver in the cold. They didn't shift their weight. They had been fed, rested, and primed. Today, they weren't just sentinels, they were a counter-offensive. Jane reached down, checking the tactical harness she had fitted onto each dog. Lightweight, reinforced Kevlar with integrated handles and mounts for thermal sensors. She looked like a commander of a ghost unit, and in many ways, she was. There through the first perimeter, Dae-sik's voice crackled in her earpiece. He was in the command hub, his finger on the pulse of the estate's remaining defenses. 2 armored transports. They aren't trying to be quiet anymore, Jane. This is a siege. Let them come, Jane replied, her voice a calm anchor in the rising wind. The more noise they make, the less they're paying attention to the ground. The gates didn't just open, they were breached by a localized explosive charge that sent a shockwave through the courtyard. The armored vehicles roared through the smoke, disgorging a dozen men in the signature charcoal tactical gear of the Golden Fang. They moved with the arrogance of numbers, their high-caliber rifles sweeping the area. Release, Jane whispered. She didn't need to shout. A sharp, rhythmic double-click of her tongue sent Titan and Ares into the fray. They didn't run straight into the gunfire. They utilized the landscaping, the low stone walls and the decorative hedges, moving with a terrifying, serpentine fluidity. The first Golden Fang mercenary never even saw the strike. Titan launched from behind a granite pillar, his weight hitting the man with the force of a car crash. Before the others could pivot, Ares was among them, a low-profile blur that took out knees and shins, dismantling the front line before they could establish a firing position. Jane moved in their wake. She wasn't just a spectator, she was the conductor of the carnage. She moved with a suppressed submachine gun, but she only fired to suppress or to distract, drawing the mercenaries' eyes away from the dogs. It was a perfectly synchronized dance of human and hound. Left flank, Ares. Flank. The Pitbull swerved mid-air, a masterclass in kinetic energy, avoiding a spray of bullets and pinning a gunman against the side of the transport. Jane followed up with a precise burst to the man's shoulder, neutralizing the threat without wasting a second. In the center of the chaos stood the Golden Fang's enforcer, a man known only as the Butcher. He leveled a heavy shotgun at Titan, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jane's heart skipped, not with fear, but with a cold, tactical clarity. She didn't have a clear shot. Titan, down. The dog dropped his belly to the wet pavement instantly, the slug whistling over his head. In the same breath, Jane launched herself over a low wall, her boots hitting the Butcher's chest. They went down together in the mud, a desperate scramble of limbs and steel. The Butcher was stronger, his hands finding her throat, but he had forgotten one thing: Jane was never alone. Ares hit the Butcher from the side, not with a killing bite, but with a warning grip on his forearm that forced him to release Jane. She didn't hesitate. She drove her knee into the man's ribs and followed with a tactical strike to his temple. The courtyard fell into a jagged, broken silence. The remaining Golden Fang hitmen, seeing their leader down and the twin shadows standing over them with bared fangs, threw down their weapons. They were professionals, and they knew when a contract had become a suicide mission. Yoon Dae-sik stepped out of the estate doors, the rain soaking his silk shirt, his eyes sweeping over the defeated army. He looked at the carnage, the calculated, precise way Jane and the dogs had
neutralized a force 3 times their size. He walked toward Jane, who was leaning against the armored transport, her chest heaving, her hand resting on Ares's damp, heaving flank. Titan was already circling the perimeter, ensuring no one else was standing. "You did it," Dae-sik said, his voice thick with a mix of awe and something that sounded suspiciously like relief. "We did it," Jane corrected, looking at the dogs. "They didn't break, Dae-sik. Not once." The Iron Tiger stood in the rain, looking at the woman who had transformed his war machines into a family. He reached out, his hand covering hers on the dog's back. For the first time, the iron wasn't a mask. It was a shield they both shared. The Golden Fang was broken. The traitor was gone. But as the sirens of the syndicate's cleanup crews began to echo in the distance, Jane knew the outcome wasn't just about survival. It was about the transformation. She was no longer a waitress hiding from the world. She was the one the world would now have to fear. "What now?" Dae-sik asked. Jane looked at the horizon, where the first hint of a cold, gray dawn was breaking. "Now, we stop reacting. Now, we hunt." The aftermath of the siege was a symphony of flashing blue lights and the low hum of heavy machinery clearing the wreckage from the estate gates. The police didn't enter. In this part of the city, the Iron Tiger handled his own burials. Jane stood on the high balcony of the main house, her hands gripping the cold stone railing. The rain had slowed to a fine, silver mist that clung to her skin, cooling the fire of the night's violence. At her feet, Titan and Ares lay in a state of relaxed vigilance, their heads resting on their paws, their breathing deep and rhythmic. They were no longer the jittery, traumatized weapons of a month ago. They were at peace, even in the center of a war zone. A soft footfall sounded behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Yoon Dae-sik. The dogs didn't even lift their heads, they simply flicked their ears in acknowledgement. It was the highest form of trust they could offer, the recognition of a pack member who no longer smelled of threat or anxiety. "The Golden Fang is liquidating their assets," Dae-sik said, his voice carrying a rare, quiet weariness. "The men who survived tonight have told stories that even the tabloids won't print. They're calling you the ghost of the Hounds. They think you're a myth, Jane." "I was a myth for 3 years," Jane replied, finally turning to face him. She was dressed in a simple, clean shirt, the tactical gear finally put away. Without the Kevlar and the weapons, she looked smaller. But the power radiating from her eyes was undeniable. Being a legend is just another way of being lonely. Dae-sik stepped into the light of the balcony, the sharp lines of his face softened by the dawn. He held out a small, leather-bound folder. Inside was a set of pristine documents, a new passport, a clean record, and the deed to a property in the countryside. "Your brother's medical bills have been settled through a blind trust. Your military record has been corrected by a friend of mine in the ministry. You can walk out of these gates right now, and Jane Vance can exist again. No more waitressing, no more hiding, and no more blood." Jane looked at the papers, the symbols of the freedom she had dreamed of since the day she left the desert. It was everything she had fought for. She looked down at Titan, who let out a soft, sleepy huff and leaned his heavy weight against her boot. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice steady. "For me to go?" Dae-sik didn't answer immediately. He walked to the railing, looking out over the city he ruled, a city that was now quiet because of her. "I spent my life building walls, Jane. I thought that if I were strong enough, I wouldn't need anyone.
I thought my dogs were a reflection of my power. But you showed me they were just a reflection of my fear. He turned to her, his gaze intense, stripping away the cold mask of the mafia boss to reveal the man who was finally letting someone in. I don't need a waitress. And after tonight, the syndicate knows I don't need another soldier. I need the person who can see the monsters coming before I do. I need the only person the tiger trusts. He held out his hand, palm up, the same gesture of trust she had used to tame the beasts. It was an offer of partnership, built not on a paycheck or a debt, but on the wreckage of their shared pasts. Jane looked at the folder, then at the dogs, and finally at the man who had seen her scars and didn't look away. She reached out, but she didn't take the folder. She took his hand. Her fingers were calloused and strong, a perfect match for his. I don't think I'm a waitress anymore, she said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. No, Dae-sik replied, his grip tightening just enough to ground her. You're the one who holds the leash. And I'm just the man lucky enough to be standing by your side. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, the four of them stood together on the balcony. The Iron Tiger and his handler, flanked by the twin shadows. The war wasn't over, in their world, it never truly was, but as they looked out over the waking city, they knew they would never have to fight it alone again. Jane Vance was gone, and the waitress was a memory. In their place stood the queen of the hounds, and the world was finally quiet.